Historical Museum. And this particular program is going to be about fairy tales. So it's learning about the experiences of two islanders that happen to be have 4 generations on the island, and who are always excited to welcome people to the island and tell them about their experiences. So this topic is called fairy tales, and I'm going to let our esteemed presenters introduce themselves. And then at the end, we're going to have a little bit of time for questions or for you to share your fairy stories. And so with that, which one of you wonderful guests, Reed or Karen, which would like to go first and introduce yourselves?
Yeah, Karen, you go ahead. You're younger.
Reed and I have always had fun sharing stories because I happen to be, 10 years younger than Reed, and graduated from Bainbridge High School in 1957. Reed, I believe you were the class of 47. Is that right?
That's correct.
So we come at something like the Ferries with a different time frame. I mean, when Reed was born, they were still paddling around in canoes from dock to dock, I think.
That's
right, Reed?
That's right. We had even the steamer was still landing at the dock in front of my place.
Yeah. Anyway, I've lived on the island most of my life, with a few little times off. I've been active with the Historical Museum. Reed and I are at an age when we are one of the artifacts.
I'm living in the house that I grew up in over Crystal Springs in 1929. I'm probably the oldest artifact still living on the island that was living in their original house. Go ahead, Karen. I'll shut up for a bit.
Anyway, to start talking about the ferries, as most of you know, the Mosquito Fleet was our earliest public transportation around the island, and there were 30 docks around the island that served the Mosquito Fleet during the late 1800s, early 1900s. And Mosquito Fleet were steamships. They were good size. Some of you have taken the Virginia 5, so you know what they're like. But they didn't carry cars. So the difference between the Mosquito Fleet ships and the ferries is that the ferries were able to carry cars. Now you may wonder how cars got to the island back in the early days. We have a wonderful document at the museum that talks about a group that came over, kind of like a AAA group, to the island in 1910, 11, I think. And they were promoting driving using the new automobile technology to see the world. And so to get to the island to promote this, because they wanted to drive around the island, there was no ferry to bring them. So they barged the boat over, landing at Port Madison. So that's how early cars got here, on a barge. In 1923, a ferry dock was built at Port Blakely. And I think they could handle maybe 30 cars on that boat. And what people would do if they wanted to get to the peninsula, they would take the ferry from Seattle to Port Blakely. They'd drive up here to Fletcher Bay, where I live. And then they would get on a little 6-passenger ferry called the Haiyu, which could take 6 Model T size cars over to Brownsville on the mainland, which I just find a charming and curious way for people to get to the peninsula from here, to go west.
Could I interject one thing?
And
on
I
that,
read,
Karen?
you take over because you have those early 10 years of what it was like back in the day.
Well, I'll just mention that my dad and I in the late 30s would take the Haiyu from Fletcher Bay to Brownsville, and then we'd drive to Seebeck, and then we'd catch a ferry from Seebeck to Brennan, which is at the foot of the Olympic Mountains, Dosey Wallops River, and then we'd drive up to the head of the trails and hike through the Olympics. And that was an easy way to get there. That's about all I have on the Haiyu. That's where we used to use it. Then in 1950, of course, it stopped because the bridge went in across Hood Canal.
Yeah, the next ferry event was in 1937, and they moved the ferry, the main Bainbridge ferry terminal, from Port Blakely to Winslow at that point. That was the year that my mom and dad came to the island for their honeymoon. So that's kind of where my family history starts. I don't go back as far as you do, Reed.
Nobody does.
Tell the story of how they built the dock at Port Blakely.
Yeah.
I mean, at Winslow.
What they did was they'd take all the slip and everything from Port Blakely and put it over at Eagledale. And we used to have a ferry, a dock at Eagledale, and the ferry would come to Seattle, then back, or come to Winslow, back into Eagledale, then go to Seattle. And in Eagledale, that's how when the Japanese were interned, that's where the ferry landed to take the Japanese from the island. And that's
right.
In about 1950 also. They had to have a double-ender ferry to go there. Otherwise, a ferry couldn't turn around like they did in Bremerton, because they had single engine ferries to go to Bremerton. Or not single engine, but single front loading.
Yeah, yeah. I can remember my dad, we lived at Pleasant Beach, and sometimes he would go to Eagledale to catch the boat. He was a commuter. And sometimes he would go to Winslow. I don't know, probably some of you've heard Anne Gowan Combs' story. I just love this. So if you've heard it before, you could probably tell it better than I can. But she tells the story of someone living at the country club who raced down to get the ferry at Eagledale and missed it in their car. And so this individual drove then around Eagle Harbor to Winslow to catch the boat when it got to that point, and parked the car, ran down the dock. The boat was about 2 feet or whatever from the dock. And this fellow jumped onto the boat over the 2 feet. And the deckhand said, you know, if you'd waited a couple more minutes, we would have landed. So you do hear stories about missing it at one and racing to the other.
Yeah. One thing I might mention at Port Blakely, if you drove down Seabourn Street now, quite a ways, you could look out in the water and you can see what's left of the Port Blakely ferry landing. Because when they put it in Dale, they just took the slip and the main part. So there's something still there.
So there are some pilings left, and then they pulled the whole slip around to Eagledale?
Yes. And
you know, it's there was a move at one time to pull up the old pilings. I don't know if anybody remembers that, but it wasn't that long ago. And I thought, what a shame, because that is a sign of our history. And here at Fletcher Bay, there are old pilings left. And we've had some really low tides this time of year, like a minus 3.5 or something. And if you go out there at a really low tide, you can find pottery shards and old bottles and, things that go way, way back. And we always tell the kids, leave them. Let somebody else find them and then leave.
Well, they still have the
But I
pilings.
love those old pilings.
Yeah, they still have the pilings in front of my place. And they're really great, 'cause that's where the crows land on and the eagles, and they're really neat. I think I'd chain myself to a piling if they decided to take them away.
So those pilings, Reed, were they ever for a ferry?
Mosquito Fleet. And then I'll get to the Point White Ferry in a little bit. Carrying up in the Winslow to Seattle was, of course, commuting. And I remember my dad would commute to Seattle to work. And there was 4 or 5 men who sat there, and I'd go now and then, and nobody dare sat in those seats to go to Seattle.
Well, you remember the story about the ferry boat bridge? And I think my dad and your dad
Who might?
used to play ferry boat bridge. And what they did is they would have this bridge game at this table where they always sat, and they hid the cards under the table. So they always had a deck of cards, and they'd play their strange form of bridge. And when the ferry landed, then something happened and it stopped, and they, probably changed 10 cents or something. I don't know what they did. But anyway, my dad got on one morning first, and there was a woman sitting at his table, at this special table. And he leaned over and he said, "Oh, excuse me, ma'am, but do you have a table ticket?" And she said, "Oh, no, I'm sorry." Okay. She got up and left.
Yeah. I have a little story about commuting. In 1947, I started the University of Washington, and I commuted for a quarter, and the ferry fare for me commuting to school out to the university round trip was 25 cents. You could get the student ticket to Seattle, and was 10 cents each way. You could get bus tokens to get the number 7 bus from 3rd Avenue to the UW for 2.5 cents. So added all together, it was 25 cents round trip. Pretty cheap.
Wow.
Pretty
It was
cheap.
lousy.
I wonder what
Didn't like commuting to the University of Washington. 1 quarter was enough. I used to go to, when I was 10, 12, 8 to 12 years old, my dad would take me in, and my grandfather would pick me up and take me up. They lived in a little apartment up in 4th and Battery, and used to go in and visit them. And that was the only way you go to get anything in Seattle. All the department stores were in Seattle. There was Penny's, there was Rhodes, there was Bon Marché, there was Frederick and Nelson, there was Nordstrom, all the old big department stores, which were pretty neat. I remember being drugged through them by my grandmother and my mother, getting very weary.
So Reed, at that time, there were different. So the stores all were at where the Mosquito Fleet stops were, right? So in order to do any big stores, you had to go into the city.
Yeah, we're talking about ferry boats to Seattle, right?
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. On the island, we had Winslow, and we had little local things, but living where we did at the south end, and like Reed did, in 1941, the they put in a ferry at Point White.
Do you have
which
the
is where
picture
the
of that?
Point
Katie?
White is
Show-
now.
Is it possible
There
to
should
show
be a
that?
picture of the Point White ferry dock.
Reed Price is showing us, going to show us a picture.
Can you show that picture I sent to you of the Point White ferry dock?
Yes, we can. Just a second here. Here it is.
Yes. Many people, most people who go to the fishing pier at Point White don't realize that that was the ferry dock to Bremerton, and it went back and forth to Bremerton about 10 round trips every day. The dock was about 100 feet longer and about 100 feet wider than the fishing pier is today. Went from 1940 to 1950. In 1940, the state bought the land from the Lindquists who owned the property. That's why the parking lot is there. And it's the same parking lot that was there when the ferry was running. And commuters, everybody along where I lived, commuted to the Bremerton Naval Shipyard from 1940 to 1950. 1950, when the bridge went in, that's when the ferry stopped.
Reed, where did the
So was that
ferry-
run by? I'm sorry. Was that run by the Blackball line?
Yes. Yeah.
Private company.
Yes, it was. It was that. Now that was
Sheila.
that was a single-ended ferry that came in, and then it had to back out to go to Bremerton.
Whereabouts in Bremerton did it go?
And when
Did it
it-
land?
Same place the ferries land
Ah,
today.
okay.
Yeah, same place. I had a job at a bakery when I was 15, and I'd catch the last ferry over at night at midnight, and then work all night in the bakery, and then catch the first ferry back in the morning to home. 65 cents an hour working at the bakery, all the maple bars you could eat. And another little story. My home is just 6 houses north of the pier there, and the Monroe kids and us would sleep on the beach. And Ed Johnson was the captain of the Rosario, real nice guy. We got to know him real well. And he'd honk the horn on the last trip, and we'd get up out of our sleeping bags and go running down to the ferry. And he'd let us come up on the pilot house and take the ferry over to Bremerton in the back and pretend we were steering the ferry over and back. And that was great fun. Get back and crawl in the sleeping bags with all the sand fleas. And yeah. So,
Well, for those of us, like I say, lived at the south end, we would take the ferry to Bremerton to do our shopping, because it was, much bigger city than Winslow. I remember when I was in the 5th grade at Eagledale, going to McDonald School in Eagledale, we had a terrific snowstorm. I mean, it was a real blizzard. It was the kind of thing that we old timers, talk about today. And they sent all of us home about, I don't know, noon, because the snow was getting so deep. So they bussed us all home, and my brother and I got home. He was in 1st grade or kindergarten at the time. And the snow had blown the door open to our kitchen, and there was a big snowdrift inside. Nobody was there. So anyway, it was really severe. And that day, my dad had worked in Seattle, and he was coming home from Seattle on the ferry. And he says he was the only car on the boat. It was the last run they made that day, that afternoon. And they tied his car down because there was green water coming through the bow and all the way out the back.
Oh my.
And my mother
Wow.
and her good friend had gone to Bremerton on Point White Ferry to grocery shop, which they did kind of like people go to Costco now. They would go over there to a Safeway or something, and they could do a big shopping. And they did it once in a while. And they got the very last ferry from Bremerton to the island, and had to plow through this snow to get home and rescue my brother and I, who were probably very happy in our kitchen with the snow on the floor.
That's great.
High school, I played football and baseball, and that's how we belonged to the Kitsap League, and that's how we got to Bremerton, Paulsbo, Port Angeles, Port Townsend, was by taking the Point White Ferry to Bremerton and driving.
Mm-hmm.
And then in 1950, the Washington State Ferries were formed, and they bought out the service that Blackball Line had here in the southern part of Puget Sound. That is when the bridge went in. So many things changed at that point. I mean, if you can imagine the island without 305, that's the way it looked until 1950-51, when the bridge went in, the highway came in, and the ferries were taken over by the state ferries. At that point, my dad had been in the advertising business in Seattle and published the state restaurant magazine. And so he knew a lot of restaurant people, and he worked out this group was formed called Clark's Ferry Concessions that bid for the concessions on the ferry, bid to run the restaurants. And they were awarded the concessions. So my dad started a completely new job managing the ferry concessions. And this was all over the Sound, all the way to the ferry. It went to Victoria. And I found this old picture that Reed's put up here. I'm going to show you this. You can see me. You see this cup?
Yeah.
My daughter has 3 of these. We preserved them. And if you look at the counter on that picture, that's what this cup is, this yellow pottery cup. In those days, you could get your steak, hamburger, whatever made right there, fresh on the grill. You could have it medium rare or whatever you'd like. You can see the prices up there. I think this picture was probably taken later, probably in the 60s rather than the 50s. I'm not sure. But anyway, it was a little more restaurant-y than it is now.
You could eat a whole meal because it took so long for the ferry to get to Seattle.
Yeah, that's right.
That's what I was wondering, is how long was the ride to Seattle then?
What do you
40
think,
minutes,
Karen?
I think.
45, 50 minutes?
I'll tell you a really short one, though. When my mother went into labor with me, they drove to the first ferry that left the island in the morning, and my dad drove on the boat, and he said, "Can anybody deliver a baby?" And they got across there in about 15 minutes.
15 minutes.
So
That's great. That's
yeah.
great.
Another.
Oh, go ahead.
When I mentioned we'd be able to go up in the wheelhouse at Point White. Well, Ed Johnson to be the skipper of the Quinault for a while, and when my kids were little, going ahead about 20 years, I would go across to visit my mother and take the boys with me, and Ed Johnson would be the captain. He'd be strolling around. He said, "Come on up." So I'd take the kids up the wheelhouse, going back and forth to Seattle from Winslow. Can't do that anymore.
No.
That was a long time ago. And, yeah, it was interesting times.
It feels
Great.
like the fair is so iconic for everyone. I think when most people first come to the island on those ferries, and so it's really great to have uh, that experience of kind of floating over from Seattle and walking off the ferry onto Bainbridge Island. And both of you have been teacher docents and have been people welcoming visitors. And so I just am remembering, when long ago before COVID-19, when we had lots of streaming visitors coming in, that's always a good thing to check in to see how they like their ferry ride.
One thing that was nice about the ferries, though, before the bridge went in, I'm not talking about the other bridge, I'm talking about Agate Pass. When you went on the ferry, you knew just about everybody on it.
Mm-hmm.
Now I'll take a stroll around just to see, maybe I'll see one person that I know, not very often. But be honest with you, being an old time islander, I really liked it back then. Ferry, people ask me, oh, wasn't it hard living on the island? Well, if you didn't want to take a ferry, you didn't live on the island. Is that?
I have a cute story that goes back to the restaurants on the ferry again. My dad was going to raise the price of coffee on the ferry in these nice pottery cups. And Walt Woodward, editor of the Bainbridge Review, was irate about this, and he wrote editorials against my dad. Dad was going to raise the price of coffee from 10 cents a cup to 15.
Yeah.
Marine highway robbery.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. One other item, people don't know this, but there used to be a ferry from Seattle to Suquamish in Indianola. And it ran until 1950 when the bridge went in, the Ag Bridge. And it went to both Suquamish and Indianola. If there's no dock, there used to be a dock right downtown in Suquamish and then over in Indianola. Because I can remember the man up in Seattle, when the ferries are ready to go, he'd yell out, Suquamish, Indianola. And people would get on the same place that they do now in Coleman Dock.
Really?
So it would be easier to get to Paulsbo from Seattle than from
I wish they
Bainbridge.
still had that, and then we wouldn't need the bridge. You could get to Costco.
That's the only problem. No toilet paper source, right?
The 4 years that I was in college, every summer I worked at the information desk on the Seattle side at the ferry terminal, which was just a great college job. For one thing, I got paid well because they made all of us belong to the Inland Boatmen's Union. So we got union wages. But this was the old ferry dock. The information desk was between the area where the Seattle and the Bremerton people lined up. So you're right there just as people were getting on the ferry. So of course, being an islander, I saw lots of people that I knew. But the distinction about that ferry terminal, there's two things I remember. You know, when you get off the ferry and you go down that ramp?
Not anymore, but yeah.
Not anymore, but you did. You went down the ramp. I can remember cars trying to drive up that ramp when they got mixed up. They thought that's how they got on the ferry. The other thing I remember, it was so decrepit that if it rained, the whole terminal had buckets all over to catch the leaks coming from the ceiling. Fortunately, they built a new terminal. Now they're building the other new terminal. So
Those are great stories.
Have one in 1945, August of 45, when World War II was over. Forget what date, but anyway, a group, 5 or 6 of us got together, and that night went to Seattle on the ferry and joined the thousands of people up and down the streets, kissing and hugging and yelling about the war was over.
well, that's great, Reed.
There's an iconic picture. It's a famous picture of the sailor kissing this woman up on the, and there was a lot of that. Yeah. Hey, nothing.
Yeah.
Great times. I don't know. Do you have anything else, Karen? Any stories or anything?
I'll probably think of all kinds of them when we get off the.
I wonder if there were any ferry outages or the dock got smashed or any stories like that.
That was a big thing in our family because it seemed like every holiday, one of the ferries would ram a dock. And when something like that happened, often they lost the electricity on the ferry. And my dad would have to go rushing off to Port Townsend or to, one of the multiple ferry terminals because they had freezers on the ferry for the food. And this was always a big catastrophe. And it always seemed to happen on a holiday weekend.
No. If you ever notice when you come into Eagle Harbor, the ferry starts slowing down way out by Blakely Rock. It takes as long to get to the dock from Blakely Rock as it does to go across to Seattle. And that's one of the reasons the old ferries used to come in a lot faster. And they didn't have the technology that the new ferries have to slow up. So that's one reason why the old ferries would come in pretty fast sometimes. If you notice on the picture of the Point White ferry, when the ferry coming in, there were big groups of logs together. Oh, there it is. See the big groups of logs? They're tied together against. Well, on a strong south wind, that ferry sometimes could not land at the dock, and it had to make a swing around and come back again. And sometimes it would hit those logs real hard. And about every year, a group would come loose, and they'd have to bring the pile driver in and put in another. They were called dolphins.
Yeah.
And of course, all the ferry stuff, everything was logs, was wood. Today, if you look at the ferry where it's landing in Port, it's all made out of steel and some forms of rubber, this sort of thing. But no more wood.
Reed, what did they call them?
Dolphins.
Dolphins, like the fish boat,
like the big.
Yeah, it's spelled the same.
Yeah.
Wow.
I remember one time when I had a good friend that lived along Point White on the water between Linwood and the ferry terminal, Point White Ferry. And at that time, the Kalakala served Bremerton from Seattle. And he woke up one morning to the Kalakala sitting on his beach. It had gone aground just right in his front yard. Do you remember that, Reed?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where on the island was that? Was it off the island?
If you were driving from Linwood out to along the water to the Point White Ferry dock.
Oh wow.
They lived on the water side of that, and the Kalakala went aground.
Yeah. I can remember there was a couple pretty heavy drinkers that used to take their car back and forth, and a few times they'd get off, leave their car on the ferry, and wander off where the passengers went off, and forget that they had a car on the ferry.
My
I don't.
my dad did that. My dad did that once. He wasn't drinking.
I know.
Yeah,
he-
I don't think
he-
you have to be a
he-
drinker to do that.
Yeah, he went to town, and he got on the ferry with his car, and then went upstairs, and he walked off and went to his office, and then at the end of the day, he went to get his car. Well, he didn't have a car. He couldn't figure out where it was, and of course, he worked down there on the ferry terminal with the restaurants business and everything, and they were just in cracking up. They had pulled his car off, and they had it there and waiting for him to finally show up, and everybody was laughing and jeering.
That's
happened.
great.
Somebody
Well,
talk
we're at about, we're at about quarter after. So I want to make sure that people who want to ask you questions or want to share have a moment. So I heard, Sheila, you have a question?
Yeah, I do. I thought maybe somebody could talk about the Dix situation.
Oh,
Dix.
geez, you could do that.
Well, you mean the Mosquito Fleet? When the one Mosquito Fleet boat, I forget which one, went from Port Blakely to Seattle, just back and forth, and the Dix was hit and sunk, and some 40-some people were drowned that lived in Port Blakely or worked at Port Blakely. And there's up at the Port Blakely Cemetery, there's a tribute to that. I may mention one other thing. My dad used to commute to Queen Anne High School in Seattle, 1914, 15, 16. And they were on the Tolo, and the Tolo was a Mosquito Fleet boat, and it was hit and sunk. And my aunt had to swim to a raft, and they were rescued. 4 people drowned, and but they were saved along with all the others who were on the boat.
When you said hit, what do you mean?
But I mean, what?
When you said they were hit, what do you mean?
By another boat. I think it was a tugboat. And those Mosquito Fleet boats were not very seaworthy. Didn't take much to tip and bring in water. If you see a picture of the Dix, you'll notice that if it went over very far, it would take on a lot of water very easily.
Yeah, they're handsome looking, but they're very tall and thin.
Yeah, and also
There.
back to the Mosquito Fleet, the one that landed in front of our place was owned by GASM, and this boat only landed at 3 docks. So the people just understand that a Mosquito Fleet didn't go all the way around the island and land every dock. There were different groupings.
Well, that's why it was called Mosquito, because they'd go this way, that way, this way, that way, just like mosquitoes do on top of the water.
Name came afterwards. They didn't say, "Hey, let's build a Mosquito Fleet." That was what they were called later on when they were so many of them, and they would race, and they took a lot. There was no Coast Guard regulations in those days.
Thank you.
Anybody else have a story or a question or anything? It was ferry boats were very important, and
Still are very important.
still are, right? Yeah, and they're very big, and they're not taking any passengers the last couple of months. That's for sure.
Yeah, they're definitely part of the fabric, I think, of Bainbridge Islanders for all of us, no matter if we were there a long time or we just moved yesterday. It's definitely the ferry boats are important.